but know this, like mark this down, highlight it, put a little asterisk next to it. He said, know this, that in the last days, do you believe we're in the last days? Yes. He said, perilous times will come. The word perilous in that original Greek means dangerous, stressful, hard to bear, difficult to endure. Dangerous and difficult days. We're living in perilous times. Jesus described the people in His day when He talked to them. He said, you are a wicked and perverse generation. The generation, He said not just certain people, but He said the whole generation that had risen up had a certain aroma to it of wickedness and perversity. You ever feel like that sometimes? You say, God, I feel more and more alone in this day, more and more like the world and its evil is just rising like a flood and a tide, and it's becoming not just certain bad people I hear about in the news, certain random outliers, but Lord, instead it seems like the whole generation is buying into the spirit of the age, wickedness and perversity. How easy it is for us to become hopeless because of this truth. Without trying, we can become so negative. By just walking out and just, as it were, breathing the air, it feels like the toxic fumes of our day and the generation kind of get into our lungs, and we kind of almost cough like, man, I have to get out of here. It's almost unbearable. Jesus, come quickly. It feels hopeless sometimes. But you know this, and I know this, and we have to remind ourselves often that our God is a God of hope. And the more I read His Word, the more we see His promises, the more we realize that He has a plan for every situation. He has a plan for the hopeless situations in my life, in my home, in our marriages, in our communities, in our world, yes, in our nation. We could almost say this, when we see an impossibility, God sees an opportunity. When we look and we say, nope, God says, hope. When we say nope, God says hope. That's how He is. And tonight we're going to look at a story that illustrates this for us. Though it happened 3,000 some years ago, it's a story that helps us to realize that no matter how dark the situation may look, and truly dark it is, God has a plan for the people who will stand up and be counted as His own. The story we're going to look at comes from Exodus. The Israelites had left Egypt just about 60 days before. 61 days before the story we're going to read, 61 days before, they were slaves in Egypt. And now, here they were, 60 days after the Exodus, and they arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai for the very reason that God pulled them out of Egypt, to meet with them, to give them His covenant. And Moses said to the people, listen, I'm going to go up and meet with God, and then I'm going to come back, so just wait for me. I don't know exactly how long I'm going to be gone, but wait for me. And a week turned into 2 weeks, turned into a month. The days were ticking by, and we turned the page to Exodus 32, starting at verse number 1. Let's read this passage and look at it together. It says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said to him, come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, this fellow Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him or what has happened to him. And verse number 2 continues, so Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Verse 4 says, then Aaron took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with an engraving tool and made it into a cast metal calf. And they said, this is your God, Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Just 60 days prior. Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. And verse 6 says, so the next day the people got up early and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to engage in lewd behavior. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, who was still up on top of the mountain, and said, "Go down at once, for your people whom you brought up from the land of Egypt have behaved corruptly." In verse 8, God continues and says, "They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a cast metal calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed to it, and said, 'This is your God Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.'" Oh, the quick change. God said they have quickly turned aside. Just a few weeks before, they were rejoicing at the glorious deliverance that this almighty God, Jehovah, had done for them. And now they had completely turned their backs on Him and given the credit to a golden calf and given themselves over. The entire generation given themselves to sin. A total turning from God, a total embracing of idols and paganism. And Moses on top of the mountain, I'm sure his shoulders just slumped. It was a day that Satan would have called a great day, but God looked down and He also had plans and wanted it to be great as well. So tonight we're going to look at the great day that happened in Exodus 32 and take some of the truths and bring it into our day to help us understand a little bit better about the heart of our God and the truth of the day in which we live. Number one, I want you to know, and you already know it, but it's this truth: this is a day that we live of great sin. The great that I speak of and the adjective that I use here doesn't mean good or wonderful, but instead the real meaning of great, which is large, significant, massive. How quickly the people turn from God to idols, from right to wrong. But that's how sin is, isn't it? When it comes, it spreads like an infection. Spreads like gangrene that consumes and kills. Doesn't it feel like in our world, just in the past decade or two, that sin has just accelerated its rise? Or all around us, the sin has become great. It's become almost overwhelming and flood-like. And as I look at this story, I learned some lessons about sin that help us realize the gravity of sin that has a parallel in our day as well. Here's some principles on this Bible study night. Principle number one about sin. The core of sin is this: letting anything take God's rightful place. In Exodus 31, it says, when they saw Moses delayed to come down, the people said to Aaron, "Since we don't want God anymore, let's make a god instead to replace this God who will go before us." You know, to our viewpoint, it sounds so silly. A golden calf, they're giving credit. They brought him up out of Egypt. They're going to worship it. But in reality, you and I as humans, we're made to worship something. We're made to give credit to something. And so if we turn our back on God, in reality, we're putting something else in that place that we become a slave to. Whatever we give ourselves to, we become a slave to that. Maybe we give ourselves over to the golden calf of our own will. Lord, I've waited long enough for you. Now I want to do what I want to do. In essence, that's where sin begins, when we've taken God off that throne and put our will there. Maybe it's just our desires of the moment. That's what happens in temptation. Our desires pull us and we have to go no to God, and our desires get placed up in that place of worship. Maybe it's our own thoughts. God said to His people, "Let the wicked put away his own thoughts and let him lift up my thoughts." He's wicked because he's made his own thoughts the God. Maybe it's when I lean on something else to bring me that satisfaction, peace, or joy that only God can. Maybe it's the world that I've become a friend to, meaning I had to turn my back on God. Maybe it's the approval of others, and it goes on and on and on. But something has taken the rightful place that God only deserves. The Bible speaks to us clearly about when the Antichrist will come. And the Antichrist will step up and say, "Worship me." You know, in our English language, we tend to think that that prefix anti means against. But you know, anti actually in the word antichrist doesn't mean against Christ, but in place of Christ. The anteroom is the front room, the lobby. This is what the antichrist is going to say. Hey, I know you believe in Christ. Okay. But now I come as one greater than Christ. I come as the true man of peace. Worship me. Take my mark on your hand and your forehead. I am the one who will bring you the satisfaction that this God you worship cannot. So place Christ behind you. I now am the Christ replacer. Oh, the spirit of Antichrist is already in this world, isn't it? Things and people and possessions that take Christ's place. That's why people can still talk about God and Jesus, but be worshiping something else because they put it in place of God. That's why while the people were down in the valley making a God replacement, Moses was up on the mount, and the first of the 10 Commandments was, have no other gods before me. God knew what he was talking about. When we keep God in his rightful place, that fear of God, that holy awe of God, it keeps us from sinning, doesn't it? Oh Lord, help us to keep you in your rightful place. That's the first principle about sin we see in this story. Principle number 2, we see here the sin of rejecting our authorities, our God-given authorities, makes us especially vulnerable to Satan and evil. It says, they said to Aaron, make us a God who will go before us, for this Moses, this God-given leader that brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't need him anymore. When we reject God-given covering and protection of our authorities, we become highly vulnerable to Satan and his deception. Consider with me a child, a 5-year-old child holding his daddy's hand, walking down a busy, crowded street in the middle of a big city. The daddy says to that child, hold on to my hand, because we got to travel these blocks. We got to get to our destination. Hold on to my hand. I'm going to hold on to you, but you got to hold on to me too, and don't let go. Oh, but Daddy, I don't know if we're going to get there. It's so big, and all these big buildings and all these people. Just hold on to my hand, and I'll see you through. The daddy is there to lead and to guide, yes, but I suppose even a child, if he's given a direction, he could head that way, 5 blocks that way. Instead, you know what the daddy's primary job is? Is to protect that little child. Suppose the child isn't happy with how daddy's holding his hand or looking too dependent on his daddy or the pace of his daddy. And he says, I want to go on my own. And he yanks away his hand from the daddy and runs on ahead and darts and disappears into the crowd. What just happened? That child is now vulnerable. Vulnerable to be snatched up in the crowd by someone who does not have their best in mind. That child is vulnerable to not understand the traffic signs and the busyness of the street and to run out and get hit. That child is definitely vulnerable to get lost in all the craziness and the buildings and the busyness. It's unlikely that child is going to reach that destination safely. The authorities in his life were there to protect him and to get him to the destination safely. The authorities in our life may not go at the pace we want or the direction we want, but God has designed their primary purpose to protect us from getting lost, from getting harmed, from falling into deception, from a stranger offering us candy and saying, come with me, I'll take you home. Oh. The Bible says that a mark of the last days is that people will despise authorities, think little of them. I don't need them, I can head out on my own. God, help us not to be like the people in Exodus 32 who said, we don't need Moses. We can find our way to the promised land on our own. Oh, Lord. That's a mark of our day, isn't it? A rejection of authority. Principle number 3. Today's sin always has a high cost on the next generation. Look what happened in verse 2. Aaron said to them, here's how we're going to make the calf. Tear off the gold rings from your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. I'm going to talk to the husbands and the daddies here tonight just for a minute, though I guess we could all listen. Husbands, and daddies, when you and I sin, our guilt, our personal guilt of our sin is not passed to our wives and our children. No. They must bear the guilt of their own sin. But the effects and the consequences of our sin is passed on to them. There is a cost. There is a cost. There is a suffering that happens in their life as a ripple effect from our sin. The same is true passed on to the next generation. So often people who are sinning themselves say, well, listen, it's my body, my choice, my future. If I want to choose to walk away from God, then I'm just going to have to bear that, and hey, only one life, right? Little do they know that they're affecting the next generation so much. The cost is high on them. I think of Solomon, who turned from God, and it says when he turned from God, he started to oppress the people terribly. Oppress them, high taxes and oppression. And when the next generation arose, they revolted against Rehoboam. They said, we don't want your rule anymore. His son paid for his foolish choices. Oh, Lord, help us to understand this when we make our choices. Principle number 4, sinful people may still maintain a form of religion. Isn't it interesting here in verses 5 and 6, it tells us that they built an altar and they made peace offerings and burnt offerings. They still were remembering some of the things that God wanted them to do, but they weren't doing it to God with the heart of love for Him. They were doing it to the golden calf. There's a great danger in our world for people to hold on to some of God and some of the Bible, to keep one foot into it, but still form God into the image they want. Lord, help save us from this. Amen? Lord, save us from cherry-picking pieces of your word that we want and holding on to it, meanwhile discarding the rest and keeping just a form of religion, but denying the full power of what it means to hold on to a full gospel, a full message. That's why you and I got to say, Lord, you lead, Lord, and I'll follow. I don't want a form. I want the fullness thereof of everything you have to offer. If God convicts us of this, let us lay aside our half-heartedness and take with a full heart all that He has for us. And principle number 5 about sin, the mountaintop, the summit of sin in any really society or culture is this: great and open immorality. This was the ultimate sin that this idol worship led to. It says the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to engage in lewd behavior. When the fear of God is pushed away in a life or a society, great sexual immorality always arises into the open and goes on almost unchecked. When the kings of Israel turned their backs on God, their ultimate act of defiance, Manasseh did this, his ultimate act of defiance was to defile God's temple by setting up pagan idol worship in God's temple. Some of the kings would set up pagan idols somewhere else and leave God's temple alone. But the ultimate act of defiance, the highest thing they could do to snub their nose at God, was to set up Baal or Ashtoreth or Molech inside the temple of God. It was the ultimate rejection of God. And the ultimate rejection of God is when we take this body, meant to be the temple of the Holy Spirit, and we totally give it over to sexual immorality. That's what Romans 1 says. Romans says when we reject God in His rightful place, the ultimate end of it is that we are given over to perverted lusts. Lusts and desires sexually that should never be. God never intended, but we are so deceived. And that is truly the mountaintop. You can't go any higher than that. Once we get to that mountaintop where there's open and unchecked immorality, God says this cup of iniquity is just about full. Oh, so sad. So sad in Exodus 32. Think of the utter grief that Moses must have felt when he got the news from God. God's people, delivered by Him, should have known better, and there they were swimming in a pool of toxic wickedness. Do you feel that grief sometimes? I felt that sometimes over these past few years. Lord, I just don't know what to feel anymore. I feel like I'm grieving. Like the people in Ezekiel 9, just grieving. I don't know what else to do. Lord, for our community, for our loved ones, for the next generation. Lord, for the years and decades ahead. And God comes down in the midst of all of this and says, I know it's a day of great sin, but take hope, because I'm going to call it a day of great opportunity. That day, before the chapter ends, turned out to be a day that God had a plan for those who would listen to Him. In a time of great sin, God's great grace, and in this great opportunity to be attached to Him, came. Spirit, pour out and touch our hearts. I love this principle for us as God's people. It says in Isaiah 59:19, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a standard against him. Isaiah 59:19. You can put that verse up for me. The word standard here means a flag that's raised up. When the enemy comes in like a flood, God's not turning tail and retreating. God's standing put and lifting up a standard and saying, this is the day in which the Spirit will be poured out. This is the day in which my name is going to be lifted higher than it ever has before. And I want you and I to say this in this second point of our sermon tonight, to say, Lord, you are going to use us. You're going to pour out your Spirit in greater ways than ever before, Lord. I know sin is great, but Lord, here I am. Use us in these opportunities. Number one, use us in the opportunity to intercede. It's the first great opportunity that came. Moses is still up on the mountain. He hasn't gone down yet, but he did what you and I should ever do if we ever get hit with bad news. We should go right to prayer. Exodus 32, verse 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have seen these people. Yes, they are an obstinate people. So now leave me alone, that my anger may burn against them, that I may destroy them. And Moses, I'll make of you a great nation. But then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your anger burn against your people, whom you have brought out from the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? He goes on to intercede for several verses that God would spare the people. How easily our sadness and our grief can turn into other things. How easily our grief can turn into doubt. A season of deep mourning with no hope. Self-pity. Maybe accusations. We're looking for somebody or something to blame for it, to lay responsibility, because we can't just be sad. We got to get angry at something or somebody. It's that government, it's that person, it's that thing, oh man. But Moses, the meekest of all men, the most humble, at that moment, he took upon himself, like Jesus would many years later, the form of a servant, and he said, Lord, though it's not my sin that I'm praying for, Lord, I will stand in the gap. Moses that day said, God, here I am to stand in the gap for these people that I really just should take your opportunity, Lord, your offer, and say, Lord, wipe them out and start with me, but he didn't. Moses could have been easily rid of a great burden. I wonder if the Lord was testing Moses, testing him to see if his faith was up to the challenge. Remember when the Syrophoenician woman came to Jesus begging for healing for her daughter? She was interceding. It wasn't her own need, it was for someone else. And Jesus kept rejecting her. No, I'm not sent to the Gentiles. No, go away, go away, go away. Jesus, please, for my daughter, please, for my daughter, please. Jesus, even the crumbs the dogs eat. And Jesus turned around and he replied, woman, great is your faith. I will give you what you have asked for. In this day, you and I might not think we are much, but listen to this. If you and I have a heart to persist and intercede for this sinful world, we're commended by Jesus as one with great faith. Jesus, I don't have much to my name, Lord. I don't have too much talent. I don't know which way is up, Lord. But Lord, I'm asking for this sinful world. Lord, for this person, for this scenario, Lord, in which wickedness seems to abound. Forgive them, Lord. Bring them back to a place of understanding. Lord, bring your healing there. Lord, you're not answering me. Lord, I need an answer. I'm persisting. I'm knocking on your door at midnight. And he says, you have great faith. You and I are in a place where we have an opportunity to intercede like never before. Don't let evil make us hopeless. Let it instead drive us to the Lord and find from him a commendation as one who has chosen to stand in the gap. This day also, secondly, turned into an opportunity to stand apart and shine for the Lord. Moses finishes praying. He comes down the mountain and he looks around, and the people hadn't stopped partying. You know, usually when mom and dad get home, and if the kids are running around wild, they see mom and dad and they stop like, oops. They didn't stop. They just kept partying. They're like, oh, there's Moses. Hey! And this is what it says in Exodus 32, verse 25. When Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, so they were disgraced among their enemies, Moses stood at the gate of the camp and said, whoever is on the Lord's side, simply come to me. And all the descendants of Levi gathered themselves together to Moses. There's an opportunity that you and I have in the chaos around us and the lawlessness in our world. It's an awesome one. We have a chance to stand apart, to be different than the world. We could say it like this. You and I have a chance to shine just by not participating in what the world is doing and just standing next to Jesus. Right? Sometimes I think we wonder like, man, I got to really work hard to convince the people at my job and my school that I'm a Christian. I wonder what I can do. Maybe I can put up like a big banner and wear like Christian t-shirts all the time. And if God is leading you to do that, then that's totally fine. But you know what? Probably all you have to do in this day and age just to stand apart and shine as a Christian is just to not participate and just stand close to Jesus. Jesus calls, we say, Jesus, I'm next to you. I'm not leaving your side, Jesus. No, I'm sorry. No, I can't attend that. No. And Peter said, they'll think you're strange because you are not plunging with them into the same flood of wickedness and filth. To be a light, all we have to do is just not cover ourselves, Matthew 5 says. This is what Paul wrote in Philippians 2. He said, do all things without grumbling and disputing, in order that you may become blameless and innocent, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine as stars in the world. You say, people kind of look at me funny at work. They're having a conversation, and when I walk up, they get all quiet. They apologize for when they use certain language around me. Boy, they must think I'm weird. No, they just recognize you as one who is not participating in standing next to Jesus. What a chance we have in our world. We just stay close to Jesus and come on the Lord's side. What a chance we have for people to ask us for the hope that lies within us. Setting apart in our heart, always Christ as Lord. It's a chance we have. Let's not give up the chance. Let's not kind of stay in the party and think we're going to stand out. There's no way we can do that. We got to stand out and apart. For the 3 Hebrew boys, all it took for them to stand apart and stand out like a sore thumb was just to stand while everyone else knelt to the statue that day. Oh Lord, help us to be your shining star. And thirdly, this day of great sin is an opportunity for us to walk in His authority. This might be the most amazing opportunity of all. The Levites stood apart for the Lord. They stood away from the party and next to Moses, only 1 out of 12 tribes. Wow. And this is what it says in verse 27. Then Moses said to the Levites, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has said. Each man fasten his sword on his side and go back and forth from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and each one kill his brother, his friend, and his neighbor. The Levites make the bold choice to stand apart. And suddenly Moses says, all right, guys, get your sword. I've got a mission for you. You've been chosen to do the Lord's work. Get your sword and go out and become executioners of the Lord's justice. Can you imagine how they felt? Moses. We're farmers. We're carpenters. We're shepherds. We don't go and execute people. That's what no. And Moses said, you're right. No one would ever take this honor upon themselves. This would only be something that you would ever do if you were given the authority. You would never go out and just stab someone to say, I don't like you, or this, or I think this is right, or, I saw you do this. No, only if God himself commissioned you for the work. And he said, Levites, today, God is sending you in his authority to do his work. What was happening in this moment? God was looking for those who would be set apart for his service, ordained by him to do his work. God said, here's some people who set themselves apart from the world, apart from sin. I'm not just going to let them just stand apart and just be separate. I'm going to send them back out into the world with a mission. Send them back out with a purpose. God is still doing that today. God doesn't say, okay, everybody, all you Christians, go barricade yourself in your homes and don't come out until you hear the trumpet blow. God doesn't say that. He sends us out in his authority with a mission to minister, to witness, to shine. Verse 28 says, the Levites did what Moses ordered, and that day about 3,000 men of the people died. And Moses said this wonderful truth. He said, you have been consecrated today for the Lord. For each of you was against his son or his brother, and so the Lord has given a blessing to you today. As they obeyed, loving the Lord, even above, family relationships, they received the blessing of the Lord, and they became, from that moment on, they received the blessing of being the ones who would draw near to the Lord, ministering on behalf of the people and be on behalf of his name in his presence, in his house. What an inheritance. It's interesting as we close this point and get ready to close our sermon. Justin, you can come to the piano. God had just said a couple chapters before, he said, I want all my people to be priests. I've raised you up from Egypt so that you might all be priests, a kingdom of priests. That was God's desire, that they would all be priests. But 11 out of 12 tribes said, no thanks. No thanks. Many were called, but few were chosen. Only one tribe was chosen. Well, you and I see this crazy time as an opportunity to say, Lord, you've called me, you've called my heart, Lord, and now, Lord, I want you to send me forth. God's calling out, who will go? Who can I send? Who will intercede? Who will stand in the gap? Who will believe for greater things? This is a great day, isn't it? This is a great day. Signs in the earth and the heaven above. Wars and rumors of wars. Earthquakes in various places. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. God is moving by his Spirit. Moving by his Spirit in Asbury University. He's moving at Calvary. He's moving in your home. He's moving in your heart. God is looking for those who will say, Lord, I will come under your standard, be called by your name, be sent out by you.